What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody looks going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I have a really good show coming up for you tonight with my two guests who are going to talk about China. This is China the New Bogeyman. First, I have Arnie Saiki, who I have known since the TPP days. How you doing, Arnie?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your show, Lauren.
Sure. And next, I have Tobita Chow, who is somebody who works for People's Action. How you doing, Tobita?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on.
Broadly focusing on regional economic and geopolitical themes in the Asia and Pacific, Arnie Saiki has written extensively about the Belt and Road Initiative, which we're going to be discussing tonight. His piece, TPP, which stands for Trans-Pacific Partnership, At the End of the Line, a briefing on economic cooperation and capacity building, was published last year in the American Quarterly by Johns Hopkins University Press. Tobita is the global justice organizer at the People's Lobby, which is a grassroots membership-driven progressive organization in the greater Chicago area. He also leads a project called Justice is Global, which aims to create a just global economy where everyone has what they need to thrive. And he is also a political educator with People's Action. China, I haven't really studied China since college when I studied the revolution against Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and the whole socialist experiment. But China has really changed since then. It is no longer this idealistic socialist economy where everybody is equal. They have become an uber capitalist economy. And they've got their billionaires and oligarchs in the same way that Russia has and that the US has. So I'm wondering, Arnie, if you can just give a very brief overview of what's happened in China politically and economically since that revolution.
I guess since the revolution, I guess we have to start off with I guess Deng Xiaoping and his great leap forward, right? Really ever since then, that was like the big sort of like first state-led economic thrust that brought China into the global system. As China has pursued, certainly more market-oriented policies, I think when we were talking about the sort of discussion between socialism and capitalism, or socialism and free markets now, I do think that the paradigm is really a kind of a 20th century paradigm. It doesn't really make sense so much anymore. I think that it's really it's an issue. We're living in a world of global markets, global capital, global trade. There's global rules, and really we're talking about regulations. And so countries and states that have more have deeper, more profound, regulatory ambitions, I think, are generally considered to be socialist, and those that don't are considered to be these free market, liberalized economies or neoliberal economies that I think many of us who follow you and who have worked with you have been trying to bury.
Okay, so basically we have had China has been kicking our butts in terms of gross national product, producing things that customers want to buy. Everything is made in China. This has been going on for decades now. There's a great trade imbalance that Trump has been trying to correct with his trade wars. I mean, it seems to have backfired. A lot of U.S. farmers are going bankrupt. We've now had to bail them out with a $12 billion package that is financed by the U.S. Taxpayers. So what do you think about the trade war and how China has responded. Because I just read an interesting article, which I shared with you, Tobita, about how there's two different schools of thought, even in China, about Trump's trade war.
Yeah, so I think this is an important point, just the fact that there are competing factions within China and within the Chinese government. I think here in the US, including among progressives in the US, it's very common to see China as this big monolith where like it's all one big thing and everyone thinks the same way. And that's not true, which is pointed out in that article that you mentioned. That points to two main factions in the ruling class in China. One is a more nationalistic faction, which sort of embraces the idea of a trade war. It thinks that, you know what, yes, the US is threatening China's rise, which is what we're all invested in. And so we need to fight back. We need to engage in a tit for tat kind of struggle with the US. And then part of this idea is also that, you know, China is going to come out on top in the trade war. So that's sort of this nationalistic faction. Then there's also a more liberal faction, which there's a couple things going on there. One is that they're pessimistic that China is going to come out on top in the trade war. I think the way that it's proceeded has sort of maybe backed up that side of things. But they also have, you know, they want to see some of the same things that China's critics in the West maybe want to see, which is greater liberalization of China's markets and things like that. And that they see that that's part of what they want to see in China too, because they think that's going to help China's growth and not this tit for tat struggle with the US. So I think, you know, I want to say that any sort of commentary on the inner workings of China's ruling class is going to be really speculative. Like it's hard, I think, really hard for us to know for certain anything that's going on within the inner circles of the Chinese government or anything like that. I will say that there's one important part of Chinese society that is left out of this discussion of these competing factions within among the Chinese elites, which is Chinese civil society, including the progressive elements of Chinese civil society, labor activists, leftist students, feminist activists, environmental activists. There's a broad range of these forces in China, and that's a perspective that is very rarely taken into account when people talk about the trade war or the broader conflict between the US and China, because I think those are our natural allies as progressives in the US.
Well, you know, that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later in the show, because that's really what you're an expert on. But I'm talking right now about kind of some of the myths that the US corporate media, or I should say first the corporate state, and then their voice is amplified by the corporate media, tries to disseminate about China. And, you know, one of them is this sort of this inscrutable, closed society that's very manipulative and that does not tolerate dissent, and there's human rights abuses. And we all, of course, remember Tiananmen Square and the massacre there. But what can either of you tell me about the human rights situations and civil liberties in China right now? You know,
there's been like a slurry of posts about students, Marxist students who are being, you know, targeted for protesting, you know, at JSEC Technologies, which is, you know, part of the, which is in China. And one of the questions that I think that's been very, very interesting, and I think perhaps maybe Tobita can speak on this more clearly, is the role of labor unions, especially within a socialist country, within a country that where if you are a socialized country and you're trying to like raise the wages and raise the living standards of people within your country, sometimes unions can be counterproductive and work in favor of certain corporations, because then it creates further discrepancies between private corporations and the larger public workspace. So it's very, very nuanced, like what's happening. And I do think that there's a reason why some of the, these students are, from Hong Kong, and they're part of this, this, part of the pink, or I guess what was the pink umbrella movement.
I think the human rights abuses in China are really serious right now. The one that gets the most attention, I think, is the crackdowns on Muslims in Xinjiang, Western province in China, which seems to be at a very large scale. Like some estimates are that there are up to 1 million people in Xinjiang in what are basically concentration camps. There's also in other parts of China, including in some of the main cities, crackdowns on civil society in general, but in particular on labor activists and worker activists. There's also crackdowns on churches, feminists, just a broad range of human rights violations in China. And this is something I take very seriously. It impacts people who I count as friends and comrades in China. But I think that's something that I think is really important to keep in mind is that the ones with the real power to address these abuses and halt them are the progressive elements in civil society. If there's going to be a solution to these, if there's going to be a real force that's countering them and putting an end to them, it's going to come from like basically our counterparts in China. And so if we want to address these human rights abuses, we need to approach it from a perspective of like, how can we be in solidarity internationally with our comrades within the country? And I think that's really important because without that perspective, concerns about human rights abuses in China they threaten to play a role where they get progressives who rightly care about human rights abuses in line with sort of right-wing anti-China nationalists. And that's a real danger that I'm quite worried about.
Yes, that's happened in Syria too, I've noticed, because, the socialists there were very much against Assad, and yet some progressives side with Assad and Russia because they're the only ones really trying to defeat ISIS, and the U.S. is supporting the al-Nusra Front, which are terrorists and an outgrowth of al-Qaeda, who before Obama intervened in Syria, we called them terrorists, but then when we started supporting them, we called them moderate rebels. So it's kind of confusing on who the good guys and the bad guys over there, which kind of leads me to believe that's their issue. We should be staying out of it. In China, I know that the breakneck speed of modernization, has had the effect of making conditions very hard on the workers. So even though they've gotten out of the horrible poverty of the peasantry, they still have, and I don't know if this was blown up by the American media, but, people who are making iPhones jumping out of factories because of how bad the conditions were.
I do think that there's a lot of misinformation that is coming out. And I think, one of the things that we do know is that, there are indeed, U.S.-backed destabilization campaigns that are going on within China, and specifically within the Muslim community. I don't think it's targeted at Muslims per se or at Islam. I think it's, but I do think that it's targeted at the independence movement within Xinjiang. And I don't know, how big these quote unquote concentration camps or these re-education camps, really are, because I don't think that we're getting we're not getting a very good or clear picture, from any reliable source, including the United Nations. And yes. I do think that if there was a UN presence there, then I think we'd have a better leg to stand on.
Yes, and I want to just bring in my show about North Korea, where it turns out that a lot of the stuff about North Korea and how they treat people there, dissenters, come from defectors, and these defectors are being paid up to $800,000 to defect now. So I'm not saying that these things aren't happening, but I think you're right that we need to be skeptical. Do you want to address the point that I made about the breakneck speed of modernization and how these workers are treated? And I'm going back to a class I took in the late 70s in college, but revolutions in the modern world. And we talked about the countries where they already had a middle class established could have things like civil rights and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Because it was like the bourgeois that started the revolution, but these revolutions from below in China, in Cuba, in Russia, you know, there was a feeling and an ideology that you had to suppress these things until everybody's standard of living was raised up. And then the question becomes, once people have attained a middle class standard of living, how come you're still clamping down on these civil and human rights?
You know, we have to remember that China is, 1.3 billion people. The United States, and just for context, the United States is 360 million people, right? I mean, and so when you consider that, 1.3 billion people have, when you consider that 1.3 billion people have been, were being raised from poverty and are entering into the middle class. The McKinsey Group did a really great study a couple of years ago, showing, giving really good statistical numbers as to how many people are moving into China's middle class, and at the same time, we can look at the United States and look at how many people are dropping out of the middle class, And so as we begin to, to sort of do a comparative analysis of what kind of economic paradigm we might want to focus on, we might want to, to look at those numbers. I don't think, and I do think that there are different indicators for the middle class between the United States and China. But one of the other things is you mentioned, these people, a lot of these laborers that are jumping out of the windows. And we also have to remember that these corporations they're Chinese managers of American corporations that have created these situations where they need to provide, quotas, and people are jumping out of the windows. But, I do think that, because of this quota system that U.S. corporations have, that U.S. consumers demand, that we are in many ways responsible for these kinds of situations.
Well, without a doubt. I mean, I heard a show on NPR the other day. It was a rebroadcast about a company. I think it was called PXP. I may be getting the initials wrong, but they're a warehouse fulfillment operation for Amazon. And they were talking about how these pregnant women were miscarrying because they weren't giving them breaks. They were making them carry too heavy boxes. They were ignoring doctors' orders. They tried to unionize with Teamsters, and they got this one warehouse unionized. And they said, do you think this is going to help? And they said, it's going to make such a small dent. And ultimately, all these jobs are going to be replaced with robots. And when you think of it, this is what a robot should do. A robot doesn't get pregnant. A robot doesn't need a break. A robot can keep doing a repetitive task like that. And I was like, oh my God. So Tobita, this is probably a good time for you to chime in, because this is a global labor issue that all workers are having to deal with.
Yeah, so you refer to the breakneck speed of development in China and the effects on workers in China. And as Arnie brought up, it's important to understand that a crucial part of that has been the integration of China and Chinese workers into the supply chains of multinational corporations, including a lot of the top companies here in the US. From the perspective of wanting to create a movement for global justice, the major opportunity that brings up is that we now have workers in the US, workers in China, workers around the world, but it's important to think about US and China, the two top economies in the globe, being linked in their labor and in exploitation by the same companies and basically the same global bosses. And that's an opportunity to organize across supply chains, across borders. And if we can find a way to do that, we would, I think, exponentially multiply our power in a confrontation with global capital. I think that's the big opportunity that's in front of us, and that's the solution that progressives should be pursuing to the problems that have been created by this neoliberal model of globalization, and not this trade war model, which inevitably ends up dividing workers across, dividing workers in the US from their counterparts in China. It makes sense to go through a little bit of history, not going back that far, but say to just the beginning of of the 2000s. So early in the 2000s, we saw a period where China was undergoing like extremely rapid economic growth, like double-digit growth, like every year. And there was also, in that context, a move from the Chinese government to pursue what they called a more harmonious society, which included making space, more space for groups in civil society, giving civil society more responsibility for managing problems and tensions among just the general population in China. And what we saw in that period was, among other things, a growth in labor NGOs, like independent worker NGOs. So, some of them were more service-oriented, but some of them were more oriented towards helping to generate a stronger grassroots labor movement. There were multiple strike waves that have occurred since the early 2000s. There was one following the economic slowdown from the financial crash. But things really started to shift after 2012, when a couple of things happened. One is that the rate of economic growth in China started to slow down a lot. It's still very high compared to the US, but it's much slower than it was in the early 2000s. And at the same time, I think in part due to the economic slowdown, the new president at the time, Xi Jinping, started to crack down on civil society, reverse the opening up that had happened in the previous period, and start to implement a series of serious repression on different civil society groups, and in particular on labor groups. And the repression on labor groups was especially important because, you know, when the economy is slowing down, you want to make sure that the companies can still maintain their profit levels, even though the economy isn't doing that well. And, you know, from a certain perspective, an important part of that is going to be keeping wages low, keeping the workers from engaging in like large scale unrest. So the crackdown on these independent labor groups was an important part of this overall crackdown on civil society and this response to this economic slowdown. And now, coming in part out of the US-China trade war, the Chinese economy is slowing down even more. And I think it's not a coincidence that right now we're seeing even more severe crackdowns on civil society, and in particular on leftist students and labor activists across China.
It sounds like no country is exempt from neoliberalism and the austerity that is imposed on the workers because of neoliberalism, except for a few socialist countries that are just by their lonesome out there in our world. Talk about, you know, because you talked about what happened when the new premier came in. That's when they started thinking about a new role for China, which was sort of insular, I would say, not thinking of themselves as world leaders. And now, because Trump has this sort of isolationist, both in terms of the economy and in terms of the military, China is trying to take over that role. And I think that's really what motivated, Arnie, when you and I met, when we were the TPP, because as we said, as we always used to tell people, look, we don't need this TPP. We have bilateral trade agreements with most of the countries in it anyway. And out of the 29 chapters, only like 7 are about trade. It's really about these corporations trying to extend their copyright or their patents or whatever. But he was positioning it, Obama, as the pivot to Asia, you know, that we were addressing this encroachment by China, the new boogeyman, trying to take over our turf, so to speak. There was that term pivot to Asia. You kept trying to sound the alarm about the militaristic aspect, that's what the pivot to Asia was more about. And I was wondering if you could talk about the militarism. Do you think, because China has made in the last few years huge investments in its navy to try to exert dominance in the South China Seas, do you think that they are the boogeyman in the sense of the way we used to make Russia the boogeyman, like, oh, if we let them get control of that, it's the domino theory, the whole world is going to fall to communism? Or do you think they're trying to maintain their sort of sphere of influence?
I feel like I have to sort of, let me kind of reframe a little bit about what we're talking about in terms of, it's not so much just militarization, but it's the intersection between trade and militarization. I think that was really the focus. We can't really talk about, you know, China looking to be like the new United States, because that was never quite the agenda. I think if we were to really trace back what led us here, I mean, it was the financial collapse in 2008, and it was the abusive of the investment regime, of the neoliberal investment regime from, you know, from the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990 through perestroika, all of the deregulations that happened all the way up until 2008. And, you know, this is where we began to see where, the abuse of unipolarity, the abuses of deregulative banking and investments, and the growth of the 1% and many of the wage disparities, and of course, you know, just a lot of the bad banking policies that created this miasma that happened in 2008. So flash forward to 2012, then we begin to see this consortium between the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And by 2014, BRICS formalized in Fortaleza during the World Cup then, and right on the sort of in the sidelines. And they came up with this brilliant declaration. And I implore everyone, you know, who's watching this to dial up the Fortaleza Declaration, and you begin to read like what it was that they were actually addressing. Because what they were addressing was a global economy for emerging markets, emerging economies that would protect themselves from the abuses of neoliberalism. And so what grew out of that were these alternative banking systems, like the New Development Bank, which was to sort of compete with the World Bank, another initiative called the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, which was an alternative to the IMF, different way, just an entirely different system. But the funny thing about this system is that it was really the post-war system that was built in Bretton Woods before it was co-opted by the Marshall Plan in 1948, 49, 50, in that period. I think many of the rules that they were looking at were still located in the rulemaking of the international system, and what they were really trying to set a reset button. So that was 2014 Fortaleza Declaration. And then now, flash forward several years later, we have the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen many of the countries who are part of BRICS suffer through sort of like court-induced regime changes, like in Brazil. Also, other countries, South Africa, other countries like Argentina, as we're beginning to see with Venezuela. I mean, a lot of countries have been overturned. There's been these court-led coups, essentially, and it was to obstruct and to undermine, the strengths of the BRICS economies, because people loved it. The developing countries and the emerging markets, they have applauded it. And one of the things that we haven't talked about, but we might want to look into, is the Africa continental free trade area. 50 countries out of 50 out of, or 49 out of 53 African nations have signed on to this free trade area, which is unbelievable. For as long as these countries only came into existence since the 1950s for the most part. They were all colonies, and so for years and years and years, these countries have sought to have interregional trade. They've been able to wanting to have cross-border trade and 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 be able to workers moving across borders and so on. And it just it hasn't happened. But I would say that as a result of BRICS, as a result of China and the advancement, and of course, of Russia and India and these new opportunities for trade, that for the very first time in history, we have like an entire continent who's actually able to create this post-colonial environment, and that is looking to harmonize with China and with Russia and with the other emerging markets, because it is at the core an anti-privatization, an anti-neoliberal agenda.
Unlike when the U.S. gets involved with the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, where they load these countries up with a lot of debt, and then they make them do these big infrastructure projects that they may not even want or need, and then they bring in these international corporations like Fluor, Halliburton, Bechtel that get all the contracts. They don't even give it to the local companies. And unlike this model, that's not what China is doing when they invest in Africa. So do either one of you want to speak to that, or do you not agree, or what?
Yeah, I'd want to qualify that a bit. So going back to like this idea that China is threatening to take over the world and replace the US as like the global hegemon. I think it's very speculative. I think when people in the US or the rest of the West sort of say that's what China is up to, there might be a bit of projection going on of like, this is the bad thing that we don't want to admit about ourselves, that we're going to project onto China. Like they want to take over the world. It's like, no, maybe it's like us who wants to like take over the world and keep control of it. What we can see is that there are some very real problems within the Chinese economy that China is trying to solve through investment into other countries, through the Belt and Road Initiative, this massive scheme to finance infrastructure projects around the world. Like there are problems like China has a huge issue of overproduction. Like it has, for example, this huge construction industry that is running out of things to do within China. And so they're looking for other uses for it. China doesn't have within its borders access to all the natural resources it needs to power its economic growth. So it's looking to secure access to those resources in other countries. China is looking for new consumer markets to get into to sell its products to, right? So these are all needs that China has to just continue its economic growth, which is something that the Chinese government absolutely has to maintain. And this investment through Chinese state companies, through the Belt and Road Initiative, like the clearest and most and like safest explanation of those efforts is that these are things that like China has to do in order to solve these tensions within its own economy. That doesn't mean that China is trying to take over the world. I think what's happening now, I think, is that but through this trade war and these other maneuvers that the U.S. and allies of the U.S. are these anti-China maneuvers that they're making, is at some point it could begin to paint China into a corner where it's like, well, okay, if like we need to pick a fight with U.S. over global hegemony in order for our economy to survive, then we're going to go down that road, and that could get very dangerous.
What is the Belt and Road Initiative? When did it start? What is it supposed to do? And what has been the U.S. And our allies' reaction to it?
I would say that the Belt and Road Initiative actually started around APEC 2011, shortly, possibly just before. Oddly enough, Secretary of State Clinton talked about it because it was part of, this. It was just one aspect of this neocon agenda that she had in, along with MEFTA, and she also brought up, this Silk Road, and she talked about this in the at the University of Hawaii in a speech that she gave at the East-West Center. Xi Jinping, I think he wasn't in office at that time, but I mean he wasn't the president at the time. But when he adopted the Belt and Road as a formal initiative, it was out of, it was, I think, very much out of BRICS, except that China was pretty much the only country that could really afford to launch an initiative like this. And so, and it did start off, fairly small and quite carefully. But then once it was clear that this was a very popular agenda and people wanted it, I mean, it really took off. And how this was seen was that when China launched the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which is for the most part seen as the funding arm for the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, of China's banks, it's still relatively small, but it's gotten a lot of press because pretty much most of the developing countries and most of the emerging economies, especially in the region, did sign on to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The two notable countries that did not sign on were the United States and Japan, because Japan has the ADB, which is the Asia Development Bank, which is seen as it's competition for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the United States, it's not theirs. I mean, they're just against it because the United States neoliberal Wall Street regime just does not fit within the Belt and Road Initiative. It's an amazing development and infrastructure initiative, and I do work working in the Pacific, and I would want to clarify that what the Belt and Road Initiative is not only an initiative that creates access to China. It's not a one-way street. It goes in many directions. So, for example, in what world previous to now did the Pacific ever have access to trade with the Bolivarian Alliance, or trade with the Caribbean Community, or to trade with Mercosur? Never, or to trade directly with ASEAN, because they just did not have that access. And the same thing could be said with Africa as well. Suddenly, what this Belt and Road Initiative does is it allows countries the ability to trade with each other, and it opens the door to what trade should have been before it was dominated by the colonial and post-colonial system. Before, I mean, if we can take like the Marshall Plan, from 1948, and just erase it, it's what the world could have looked like in this, when the United Nations was first formed. And so I do, tend to idealize it on those terms because that's the potential. I mean, you have these new states, and we have to remember that a lot of these states, were only recently formed from like the 1960s on, from the decade of decolonization. And we're not talking about these supply chains and these trade routes and these access points. They didn't exist, before. They were all part of like the colonial empire. And this is something where, when we're talking about BRICS again, I mean, we don't often talk about Russia. And this is a show about China and not Russia. But what Russia did, for decolonization is huge. I mean, if it wasn't for Russia, there wouldn't be. I mean, really, there wouldn't be African countries. I mean, they literally created, the process by which countries can become independent. Through what's called Article 1514 or something. I think it's UN General Resolution 1514, the Declaration on the Rights of Countries and Peoples, or something of that sort. And that was passed in 1960.
But it sounds like you're talking in a very sanguine way about this initiative and what its possibilities are. And I'm hearing, reading between the lines, that it's more of a multipolar world than a unipolar world, where each of these countries have equal weight, and they're not just, the conditions aren't being rammed through by the U.S. and the West.
So I may want to moderate some of that. So earlier you mentioned that BRICS, and I think by extension you would say this also of the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's an anti-neoliberal agenda. I wouldn't go that far, and like I don't think at all that China is a benign, altruistic, actor in the world.
Right.
Not that, Arnie, you use those terms, but like, I want to avoid, in general, like thinking about China or anything, or about the Belt and Road or anything else in terms of like, well, is it good or is it bad? The question that we as progressives should be asking of everything within the US and internationally is like, what's the progressive potential here? So does the Belt and Road Initiative have progressive potential? And I think, you know, we need to recognize the abuses that exist, the way that in some cases, the Belt and Road Initiative has functioned as a debt trap. For example, as happened in Sri Lanka. I think there are concerns with the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of the financing is going into coal plants, which is a threat to our global climate change plans, although that's also a function of the demand within those countries. Like developing countries currently feel a need for coal plants because they see that as the way to lift themselves out of poverty in the absence of a viable alternative for them. All that said, I recognize there are lots of abuses and problems with the Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, I think there is tremendous progressive potential in the Belt and Road Initiative. It is an international infrastructure building project on an unprecedented scale. Described that way, it is a thing that progressives should see a lot of potential in, right? Connecting the world in new ways, improving the quality of life. Potentially, if we could channel this huge pool of investment into clean energy rather than coal plants, which I think is possible, it is also potentially a route towards a more multipolar world rather than a unipolar world. However, all of this progressive potential, whether we actually can use it or not, depends tremendously on how the US government responds and reacts to it, right? Right now, the US government response, and this is a bipartisan thing, it's not just Trump. Most Democrats on board with this too. It's like the Belt and Road Initiative is a threat. It's a threat to the global order. It's a threat to US interests, and we need to crush it. That destroys all of the progressive potential and leads us into a route of escalating conflict with China, leading, I think we're on the verge of a Cold War with China already. It could escalate into a hot war. And that is the nightmare scenario. So these are two stark alternatives that I want to lay out for us. One is we're currently on a road to just global disaster, but there's also another possibility where we can exercise the progressive potential in this huge, ambitious project that China has brought to the world. That's going to be hard, but I think the possibility is there in front of us, and it's going to be up to progressives in the US to figure out something to do with that.
Well, what is the way we can get to this? Because it seems to me, I always say like the benevolent dictatorship in Plato's Republic, you know, if you had good authoritarians, you could get shit done. You know, the problem with the left is we're so democratic and we debate and we discuss and we get infighting and nothing happens. And meanwhile, the authoritarians kind of ride roughshod over us. And yet they're not really benevolent ever. I mean, they're never benevolent. And so if you have in China where you have all these, you don't have a free speech, you don't have a free press, you have the labor being cracked down on, you have this authoritarian government that's trying to do this thing. You know, my understanding is that they have more stringent environmental laws in China, which they ought to have, because I've never been to Beijing, but I certainly wouldn't go there without buying an oxygen mask or whatever. The pollution is horrific. And yet on the same token, I've heard that these environmental laws are not followed because there's a lot of graft and corruption in China and people can be paid off. But this Made in China initiative, which I don't know how that relates to the new Belt and Road, but it's a plan to develop a worldwide energy grid that you talked about, Arnie. And if it's based on coal, I mean, we just fought this in California. Trump wanted to regionalize the grid. There was a bill here in California that we fought off successfully, activists, because it would have, you know, we have clean energy standards here in California that are much greater than the rest of the Western region. And if we had to deal with North Dakota and Wyoming and some of these Republican states that have a lot more coal, we would be bringing in we would be forced to bring a lot more dirty energy here into California. Even if they have the best in mind as far as going wind and solar, with the graft, with the corruption, with the oligarchs, with all the things that get in the way of anything progressive ever happening, you know, what are the chances of this becoming the idealized version that it could be?
The United States has a weapon, and I'm not talking about like a nuclear weapon, but it has its media. I mean, you mentioned China does not have a free media, but we have a propaganda machine which provides, which is so good at dispensing, disinformation, misinformation over and over and over again, so often that we begin to see it as truth. I mean, it just reminds me of the three witches in Macbeth. I mean, you keep repeating this chant over and over again, as if we become indoctrinated, as if suddenly we know something about China when really we might not. And I think this is where the debt trap issue comes in, because one of the things that is never mentioned in this quote unquote debt trap scenario, especially with China's relationship with taking over the Sri Lankan port, is that Sri Lanka had an election. The new president refused to acknowledge or refused to accept the previous administration's treaty or agreement to build this port, would not pay for it, and so China just said, "Oh, we'll take it over." It wasn't this debt diplomacy as this bad debt trap that we're talking about. It was but we framed it that way. We talk about, like, here we have an example of China entrapping an economy with debt, when really it was because a new government just refused to acknowledge the investment, China's investment of this port done by the previous president. All right, so that's just that, right? In regard to the environment, one of the things that I find like really, really shocking is one of the most amazing environmental ecological restoration projects in the history of the world, just happened, in the last, 5 or 6 years. And in 2013, the World Bank produced a video on what's called the Loess Plateau. I hope everybody again will like dial that up, because it's amazing to watch. It's LOESS, Loess Plateau. I know that there's a Chinese name for this area, but I think it's in the Xi'an province area. But it's this area that's the size of Texas, and for centuries this place had been whatever the term would be, right? Because of bad grazing practices, it just desertification, all of this stuff happened. And it's also a place was very, very poor. A lot of people lived in caves. So what China did was they organized this massive ecological restoration package, where essentially they brought millions of hands to work, created some new rules regarding like grazing, gave people these tracts of land that they would be responsible for and that they could take to market. Yeah, I mean, they did this amazing restoration project that changed this this area of China that is the size of Texas. I mean, everyone should look into that when we're talking about what China is capable of in terms of the environment and ecological sustainability, because it's amazing. I mean, 10 million people can do a lot.
So the currency manipulation, you hear a lot of these politicians saying, yes, but China manipulates their currency and we've got to do something about that. True or false?
Yes, it's true, but I also think it's overdetermined. I mean, Japan, is a currency manipulator. England is a currency manipulator. Korea is a currency manipulator. I mean, countries manipulate their currencies all the time. And the fact is that the trade deficit, it really isn't that big. Especially when you compare it to again the financial collapse and also the bailouts. And if we really want to talk about a currency manipulation, I think in many ways you have to look at the United States as the international trade currency. I mean, that in itself is the biggest manipulation of currency ever in the history of the world. I mean, there's no reason for the US dollar to be the international trade currency. That's number one. And number two, I mean, the quantitative easing, the 1, 2, 3 packages. I mean, that's, I think, 1 point something trillion, another 1 point. I mean, we're talking about close to $3 trillion of quantitative easing, which I think in many ways people, you could use. I mean, of course, there are like tweaks in differences, but you could say that was currency manipulation, because really, it's like our economy collapsed.
Can I just add one thing to that? The big accusation is that China manipulates its currency to be to be lower in value so that the US dollar is stronger relative to Chinese currency. So then that increases the trade deficit. There was a period of time when I think there's evidence that China was doing that, but that ended years ago. Following that, there was a time when China was actually manipulating its currency in the other direction. Now, the US dollar is again rising against Chinese currency. That is in large part due to Trump's trade war, which is justified in part by pointing to China's currency being like so weak. Yeah, there's a time when maybe that discussion had some validity. That is far in the past, I think.
Okay, and finally, I want to go back to the question that I don't think you answered, Arnie, about the military threat. I read a whole article in the New York Times about this, about how much money they've put in the last 5 years into their Navy, into ships and submarines and missiles. And is that something that is just protecting their sphere of influence, those South China Seas, or is it something that we have to worry about?
This the militarization took place, with Obama in 2011, with the announcing of the Pacific Pivot, and this is where we really begin to see this intersection of trade and militarization, and a lot of this was centered around the South China Sea. And if we want to talk again about a sort of a bad PR campaign, I mean that's what the United States has done. Actually, it was a great PR campaign because it just created so much like propaganda around this issue of the South China Sea. I mean, the truth of the matter is that it's a disputed territory. But China did not do anything against international law. Even when you're looking within the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, China's borders are there within the annexes, and it was located within UNCLOS. Even with the United States going to the Philippines and taking this to the permanent court of arbitrations, the sort of like fake UN court, because it's not a UN court, it's like a private court that takes place within the ICJ. To hold this, this court, and I mean to hold this case against China, it was China wasn't even there to defend itself. There's so much to this case, where this is really disputed territory, and the development of China's military has been there yes, of course, to protect its borders, but it's also, you do have to protect these trade, these new supply chains, these new trade routes. And one of the things that, part of this Russia-China partnership, because, again, in 2014, around that time, Russia and China signed the Security and Economic a Security and Economic Partnership. And and again, the reason why the Africa Continent Free Trade Area even exists to this day is because I think it has a lot to do with this military to be able to protect, this new free trade area. I think a lot of countries now feel emboldened to be able to step away from the colonial paradigm without fear of a Libya or of a Ukraine or of a Venezuela or of a Honduras or of many of these destabilizing arrangements that the United States has been organizing for a very long time. I mean, really since decolonization. Well,
we're going to have to leave it here. I'm going to give you, Tobita, the last word. Tell our viewers, how should we be looking at China? Friend or foe, or somewhere in between?
There's a couple of levels to that. I think that as we look to the 2020 elections and hopefully getting a progressive candidate into office in the White House, we need to think about how the US government can enter into a cooperative relationship with the Chinese government and accept, because this is a reality, that China is gaining in power in the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, we are not going to be able to stop that short of like full-blown military conflict. So let's figure out a way to work together and to use some of the progressive potential that is in projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. Like, I frankly think what we need to see is a progressive US government buy into the Belt and Road Initiative and join it and say, we will do this with you. Yes. It needs to be clean energy. It needs to have labor standards and so on and so forth.
Right.
But then, none of us is going to be president, right? So we're actors in US civil society. We need to be looking for opportunities to be in solidarity with our counterparts in China, particularly now when it's a very challenging political terrain for them due to the crackdowns that the government is leading.
I would say that we need to speak to Ro Khanna. He's on the Armed Services Committee, and he's very progressive, and he has a real nuanced view of these things. He spoke out in favor of the zero withdrawal. He is cautious about what's going on in Venezuela. I imagine Tulsi is as well. And Bernie probably needs to be talked to, because unless he gets educated on some of these countries, he tends to drift to the status quo. And I was tweeting him like a couple of times last week, oh, Bernie, please don't join the majority of people and say something about Maduro being a brutal dictator who was not a legitimate, and he did this nuanced kind of 3-part tweet that ended up with, and we must, with the election, there being some question about the election and with the protesters being, fired on or whatever, we must not engage in a regime change coup, So he kind of ended up in a good place, but he took a couple of givens for things that, may be debatable. But I want to thank you very much for joining me and helping explain this complex subject. And I know there's so much more we could have talked about, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Lauren. Thank you,
Lauren.
Thanks, everybody, for watching, and keep fighting.